the time of Stephan Gruber from Carleton University. Stephan will give us a summary on the most recent study on permafrost degradation and the effect of such degradation on mountain systems. Good morning, Stephan. It's your time.
Good morning. Does this work? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. Good morning for everyone here in Europe, and hello to everyone else. I'll take you away a little bit from the theme of this session, because I'm not really speaking about water towers or glaciers, but about permafrost. And I will try to stick to the 10 minutes to help us move along. So the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, SROC, in its own words, revealed the benefits of ambitious mitigation and effective adaptation, and conversely, the escalating costs and risks of delayed action. And contributing to not delaying action and to supporting effective adaptation is what brings us here in a way. And for permafrost, I'd like to ask, how can we best do that in mountains? And I want to explore how operational services for permafrost can fill a critical gap in enabling adaptation to future permafrost thaw. If we look at the summary for policymakers of the SROC report, then the challenges we're facing can be summarized with these three statements. Essentially, there's going to be widespread permafrost thaw. This is going to change hazard regimes. And the established risk reduction approaches we have are going to lose their effectiveness. When we think about implementing responses, then a number of statements here are important. One of them is that the people with the highest exposure and vulnerability to current and future hazards are often also those with the lowest adaptive capacity. And I want to stress that this doesn't speak about the innate capacity that people have. Often people living in mountains or in the Arctic are actually very capable in adapting to new circumstances, but it speaks to the resources they have. And part of those resources are usable information about the future to which we are trying to adapt. Another point here is intensifying cooperation and coordination. Another point is utilization of multiple knowledge systems. That refers to using scientific and engineering knowledge along with and in concert with and interwoven with local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And then there is a final statement here that says monitoring and forecasting can inform adaptation. So these are some considerations for implementing our responses. But how really do we inform adaptations? We could ask, what decisions are involved in addressing challenges of permafrost thaw? Who makes these decisions? What knowledge or data is needed to inform these decisions? Who holds or can produce the knowledge that is needed? And what form of delivery is appropriate for the intended users? And these questions are important and difficult to answer because permafrost is not directly visible and it may not be on the minds of knowledge users immediately. And so having permafrost maps, for example, for mountains is important, but just producing a map may not be, us doing the best we can. So climate services are a useful framing for this because the concept has been around for some time now, and it has created quite a bit of experience and insight over the last several years. They're defined as information and products that aid decision-making of individuals and organizations and enable preparedness in early climate change action. And there are other similar definitions around, but essentially climate services focus strongly on supporting decisions. So on what is it that we try to accomplish, and they focus on co-development. That means developing these products together with the users and the producers of the knowledge and engaging in that in an iterative process that is decision driven. And then there's this saying of going beyond the loading dock approach, where several decades ago, someone complained that a lot of national weather services, they just produce some data and put it out there. And then the people who need it actually have to go there and see how they can use it. So with these topics, there's a lot of experience already. And if we look at the little diagram on the right, that's an illustration from the Global Framework for Climate Services. Then this looks like it's some large, complicated organization. But really what it does is it shows to us that more is needed than just the making of observations and then research and modeling. And that many of these individual elements are connected with capacity building that's in a way transcends them. And we also see at the top that the users are very diverse. So it could be governments, it could be people making individual decisions, and it could be other scientists. So when we look at how permafrost is special and what permafrost climate services could look like, then I'd like to start with the little soil core that you see on the right. So for people who have never drilled in permafrost, we're really not interested in the temperature so much as we are in the loss of ice that's in the ground and that has been in the ground for a very long time. And so measuring temperature for us is just a proxy, because when ice in the ground melts, it creates hazards, and we care about these hazards. So in the past, dealing with permafrost, we would just think about how do we build something in order to not disturb the permafrost. Whereas now increasingly we have to take into account climate change and say, well, when and how much might we be faced with consequences? So there's an intersection of human activity and climate change as a large scale driver. I've put this in this Venn diagram where you see in the red circle, you see infrastructure and land use as we have it. These are the things we're interested in where we might incur impacts. And then you have the terrestrial environment. And where these two overlap is the area of traditional hazard assessment and stable climate. And there's an established engineering and land use planning practice for this. Where climate event and trend, the blue circle overlaps with the red circle, we have where climate and infrastructure land use interact, and assessing hazards in stable climate is established practice, and hazards under climate change that emerge from the direct interaction between climate and infrastructure or land use are this emergent field of permafrost climate services. But somewhere in there, what I've picked out with this red line is the intersection of all three. And that's where we have hazards in permafrost areas under climate change. And this is something that we haven't really wrapped our heads around very well. And there are a few other distinct attributes that we could distill for permafrost climate services. One of them would be history. So the ordinary climate services evolved from existing services, such as national weather services, whereas for permafrost, we mostly start from scratch. Then there's perception. Permafrost areas are usually in the periphery, not where the global urban centers are, and hazards affect relatively few people directly. And there's process and perceptions, where we really need to combine what we know from atmospheric science and from the subsurface geology and geotechnics. And this doesn't always combine very easily because that's a little bit new. So let's look at some of the emerging permafrost services that we have globally. There are a number of international efforts, for example, the GTNP and permafrost CCI. GTNP is part of a global tiered climate monitoring. Permafrost CCI is an ESA initiative, and they're aligned with WMO and climate monitoring principles. They're sustained over many years, although sometimes actually sustained with very, very little funding. And I would say they primarily look at scientists as users. In Switzerland, there's PERMOS, the Swiss Permafrost Monitoring System, focused on monitoring with a very mature governance, mandate, stable staffing, and about 20 years of experience. And what I think is very special about that is that they published the Swiss Permafrost Bulletin that provides results in context with explanation for non-specialists. So that's already one form of delivering the knowledge to users. And then in Canada, where I've been working for the last 8 years, there are multiple databases from federal and territorial geological surveys that are coming online slowly. databases that have both geotechnical data about the ice content in the ground and about temperature changes. And also there is a new and growing Canadian Centre for Climate Services. That center has a Northern Data Working Group that also has a focus group on permafrost. So there is already a starting intersection between the world of permafrost and the world of climate services. And then we've started a national scale strategic partnership network that's called NSERC PermafrostNet, where we have participants and governance filled with knowledge producers and knowledge users, and where we're prototyping permafrost climate services and data interoperability. And at the moment, we're leading a national strategy exercise thinking about, well, what is it that we need for preparing Canada for permafrost thaw? Now, overall, what we want to do with all of this is we want to go from best practice to next practice. On the right-hand side here, you see the usual risk equation where risk equals hazards multiplied with exposure and then vulnerability. And below this, you see the major drivers where one of them is development. This is how we decide to go about land use or engineering. And then we have permafrost thaw that affects hazards, but permafrost thaw is also affected by development. And we know this in our established best practice, and the best practice looks at avoiding disturbance to permafrost. But what we need for the future is the next practice. How do we do something different but suitable for a future that we don't really know yet? There we also have climate change forcing permafrost thaw. And so the forward-looking adaptation to hazards from transient permafrost thaw needs to consider climate-driven thaw and disturbance. And to do that properly, it's probably not enough to always have the data produced through master's or PhD theses from universities. And we might actually need these permafrost climate services to enable and inform such next practice. To wrap this up, I think that permafrost services are one piece in the puzzle to enable adaptation, and it's currently missing. I have this little Venn diagram on the upper right where you see global permafrost and then mountains. They share a lot of characteristics, even though mountains are quite distinct. And so that means that as permafrost climate services gain importance globally and in individual countries, there will be a lot of opportunities to create connections and critical mass. The framing as climate services and permafrost climate services is useful because it emphasizes co-production and informing decisions as our aim. And finally, investing into permafrost climate services is not only going to help adaptation, it's also going to further basic research, think about the importance of climate modeling and atmospheric research. It's also going to ultimately help us to better understand permafrost carbon feedback. And with that, thank you for your attention.